Laziness is rarely loud or dramatic. It does not announce itself as failure. It arrives quietly, disguised as comfort, delay, and tomorrow. And before you realize it, your greatest possibilities have slipped past without a sound. Our laziness is often misunderstood. We imagine it as doing nothing, wasting hours, lying still while life passes by. But laziness is far more subtle than that. It does not primarily steal your time. Time moves on regardless. What laziness truly takes from you is your sense of direction. A person can be very busy and still be deeply lazy. They wake up early, attend meetings, scroll endlessly, respond to messages, and yet move nowhere meaningful. Why? Because without direction, movement is just noise. Laziness quietly replaces intention with routine. You are active, but not alive. .dr direction is what gives effort meaning. When you know where you are going, even small steps feel powerful, but laziness dissolves that clarity. It whispers, there's no rush, you'll figure it out later, just stay comfortable for now. And slowly, without resistance, your inner compass begins to spin. This is how potential fades, not through dramatic failure, but through aimless continuation. Days blur together, weeks pass unnoticed. Years slip by while you remain preparing to begin. Laziness convinces you that drifting is safer than choosing a path, because a path demands responsibility. And responsibility to the lazy mind feels frightening. When direction is lost, talent becomes heavy. Intelligence turns into overthinking. Dreams feel distant and unrealistic. You may even begin to doubt yourself, not realizing that the doubt comes from standing still for too long. Motion creates confidence. Direction creates motion. Alan Watts often reminded us that life is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be lived. Yet laziness turns life into a waiting room. You are alive, but you are waiting. Waiting for clarity, motivation, permission, or certainty. But clarity comes from engagement, not withdrawal. Direction does not require a perfect plan. It only requires commitment to movement. The lazy mind demands guarantees before acting. The awakened mind understands that direction reveals itself while walking, not before. The tragedy is not that people fail. The tragedy is that many never truly begin. They postpone their lives until some imaginary moment when everything feels right, and that moment never arrives. The moment you choose direction, even imperfectly, laziness loses its grip, because direction gives meaning to effort, and meaning makes effort natural. You do not need to know your final destination. You only need to stop drifting. Have you ever felt busy but directionless, or caught yourself drifting instead of choosing a path? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflection might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Laziness rarely announces itself as resistance. More often, it arrives disguised as comfort, a soft chair, a familiar routine, a predictable day. Comfort feels harmless, even deserved. Yet this is precisely why it is so dangerous to your potential. Growth by its nature is uncomfortable. It asks you to step into uncertainty, to stretch beyond what you already know, to risk looking foolish or failing publicly. Comfort, on the other hand, promises safety. It says, stay where you are. Nothing bad will happen here. And it is correct. Nothing bad will happen. But nothing meaningful will happen either. When comfort becomes your priority, progress becomes optional. You begin to negotiate with yourself. I'll start tomorrow. I've had a long day. I deserve rest. Rest, which should restore you, quietly turns into avoidance. Over time, you confuse comfort with peace, not realizing that true peace comes from alignment, not ease. The lazy mind clings to what is familiar because familiarity feels like control. Even an unsatisfying life can feel safe if it is predictable. People remain in jobs they dislike, relationships that drain them, habits that shrink them, not because they are trapped, but because leaving comfort requires courage. Comfort dulls sensitivity. It numbs curiosity, makes the extraordinary feel unnecessary. Why struggle to become more when life feels good enough? This is how potential slowly falls asleep, not through pain, but through sedation. Alan Watts often spoke about the illusion of security. He reminded us that at the attempt to make life permanently safe is the very thing that makes it fragile. When you avoid discomfort, you also avoid transformation. You become skilled at surviving, but forget how to truly live. Notice how alive you feel when you face a challenge. Your senses sharpen, time becomes vivid, energy appears from nowhere. That aliveness is not an accident, it is a signal. It is life inviting you to participate more fully. Comfort whispers, don't disturb the balance. Growth replies, there is no balance without movement. Laziness chooses comfort because comfort asks nothing in return. Growth asks for effort, attention, and presence. Yet it gives back something far greater, meaning. The goal is not to suffer unnecessarily, but to stop confusing ease with fulfillment. A comfortable life can still feel empty. A challenging life, when aligned with purpose, feels rich and awake. The question is not whether comfort is wrong. The question is whether comfort has become your ceiling. Where do you feel comfort holding you back right now? In your habits, your work, or your mindset? Share your thoughts in the comments. Awareness is often the first step toward movement. There is a particular kind of laziness that feels productive. It sits quietly behind complex thoughts, endless planning, and constant analysis. We call it overthinking, and because it looks intelligent, we rarely recognize it for what it truly is: avoidance. The overthinking mind believes it is being careful. It wants clarity before action, certainty before movement, assurance before risk. Yet life offers none of these things in advance. The demand for perfect understanding becomes an excuse to delay engagement with reality. This is how laziness hides behind intelligence.br. A sharp mind can imagine every possible outcome. It can foresee problems, failures, judgments, and regrets before they happen. And so, rather than stepping forward, the mind loops endlessly, rehearsing scenarios that never arrive. Action feels dangerous. Thought feels safe. Or Alan Watts often reminded us that the intellect is a marvelous tool, but a terrible master. When thinking dominates living, experience becomes second-hand. You are no longer dancing with life, you are watching it from the balcony, commenting on the choreography. Overthinking creates the illusion of control. It says, if I understand everything, I won't get hurt. But life is not something you conquer with thought. It is something you participate in. And participation requires vulnerability. The lazy aspect of overthinking is not the thinking itself. It is the refusal to act without guarantees. You may tell yourself you are preparing, but preparation without movement eventually becomes stagnation. The mind grows busy, but the body remains still. Notice how overthinking often arrives at the edge of action. Right before you speak, start, leave, or commit. It rarely questions comfort, it questions change. In this way, overthinking protects the familiar, even when the familiar is unfulfilling.br. True intelligence moves with humility. It understands that mistakes are not evidence of failure, but part of learning. Overthinking, on the other hand, demands perfection and punishes imperfection, which is why it rarely allows anything new to begin. When you stop waiting for certainty, something curious happens. The mind relaxes, energy returns, action becomes simple again. You discover that clarity is not the prerequisite for movement, it is the result of movement. Life does not ask you to think less. It asks you to trust more.br. And trust does not come from analysis. It comes from experience. The moment you take a step, the fog begins to lift. Not all at once, but enough to keep moving. Do you feel stuck in overthinking right now? Where has thinking replaced action in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your awareness could inspire someone else to take their first step. Laziness rarely destroys your life in a single moment. It works patiently, almost politely, through small delays that feel harmless at the time. You do not say no to your potential, you simply say later. And later, repeated often enough, becomes never. Each delay seems insignificant. One more day of rest, one more week of waiting, one more year of preparation. Individually, these moments feel reasonable. Together, they quietly shape the story of your life. What makes delay so dangerous is that it does not feel like failure. There is no doctor, a matic collapse, no visible loss. Life continues. You function, you survive. But beneath the surface, something subtle is happening. The future you once imagined is slowly drifting out of reach. Alan Watts often spoke about time not as something you possess, but as something you are. When you postpone living, you are not saving time, you are postponing yourself. The cost is not measured in hours, but in unlived experiences. But regret does not usually come from what we did and failed at. It comes from what we never attempted, the conversations we avoided, the risks we postponed, the truths we delayed speaking. Laziness convinces us that waiting will make action easier. In reality, waiting makes fear stronger. Each delay strengthens the habit of avoidance. The mind becomes comfortable with postponement. You begin to identify as someone who will someday, rather than someone who acts. And identity, once formed, is difficult to escape. Small delays also erode confidence. Every time you choose comfort over courage, a quiet message is sent to yourself: I do not trust me. Over time, this weakens your belief in your own ability to change. You are not less capable. You simply stop proving capability to yourself. The irony is that the moment you act, even imperfectly, much of the fear dissolves. Delay magnifies fear. Action reduces it. Life does not wait for readiness. It responds to participation. The longer you delay, the heavier the first step feels, not because the step is larger, but because you have trained yourself to avoid stepping. The purpose of awareness is not guilt, but awakening. Recognizing delay as an invitation, not a condemnation. The present moment is always available. It does not hold grudges. You cannot change yesterday's hesitation, but you can interrupt today's. Is there something you've been delaying that you know matters? But what would change if you acted today instead of later? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your honesty might help someone else break their delay too. Laziness is often misunderstood as a lack of energy or ambition. But beneath the surface, it is more frequently a quiet fear. The fear of failing, of not being enough, of discovering our limits. We call laziness as sometimes the mind's attempt to protect the ego from discomfort. Failure threatens the image we hold of ourselves. It asks us to step into uncertainty, to risk looking foolish, inexperienced, or inadequate. Laziness offers a convenient escape. It says if you don't try, you can't fail. And so avoidance feels safer than effort. Alan Watts often reminded us that the ego is deeply invested in control. Failure represents loss of control, a moment where outcomes no longer obey our plans. Laziness becomes a strategy to avoid that loss, keeping us safely within familiar boundaries, even if those boundaries slowly suffocate our potential. Fear of failure does not shout, it whispers. It disguises itself as overthinking, perfectionism, or endless prep. Oration. You tell yourself you're waiting for the right time, the right mood, or the right conditions. But beneath that waiting lies a reluctance to face uncertainty. The tragedy is that avoiding failure does not protect you from pain. It merely delays it. The pain of failure is temporary and instructive. The pain of stagnation is slow, quiet, and lasting. One teaches you who you are becoming. The other leaves you wondering who you might have been. Failure is not a verdict on your worth. It is feedback. It is life responding to your participation. Every skill, every mastery, every meaningful achievement carries the fingerprints of countless failed attempts. To refuse failure is to refuse growth itself. Laziness thrives when we confuse comfort with safety. Comfort feels peaceful, but it is often deceptive. It numbs the inner voice that urges movement. Over time, comfort becomes a cage, pleasant, familiar, and limiting. When you act despite fear, something important happens. Even if the outcome is imperfect, you gain self-trust. You prove to yourself that fear does not control you. Action rebuilds confidence faster than success ever could. The irony is that failure only has power when we resist it. When we accept it as part of the process, it loses its threat. The moment you allow yourself to fail, laziness begins to lose its grip. Growth does not ask for certainty, it asks for participation. What fear has been holding you back from taking action, Bar? Have you ever avoided trying because you were afraid to fail? Share your experience in the comments. Your story may give someone else the courage to begin. Laziness rarely announces itself as a dramatic decision. It does not say, "I will waste my life today." Instead, it appears as small delays, a promise to start tomorrow, a decision to wait a little longer, a belief that time is abundant and forgiving. These delays feel harmless, almost reasonable, yet they quietly shape the direction of an entire life. The human mind has a remarkable ability to underestimate the power of small actions repeated over time. One day of inaction seems insignificant. One missed opportunity appears replaceable. But when these moments accumulate, they form habits, and habits eventually form identity. Alan Watts often spoke about the illusion of time as something we can possess or control. We behave as though the future is guaranteed, as though there will always be another moment to begin. Laziness feeds on this illusion. It whispers, "Not now," and that whisper, repeated often enough, becomes a permanent silence. What makes delay so dangerous is that it disguises itself as patience. We tell ourselves we are being careful, strategic, or thoughtful. But there is a difference between waiting with awareness and waiting out of fear. One is intentional, the other is avoidance. Regret does not come from a single bad decision. It comes from a long series of postponed ones. It is born in the quiet realization that the life I imagined was always possible, but never acted upon. By the time regret speaks, the cost of delay has already been paid. Small delays steal something irreplaceable: momentum. Momentum is not created by inspiration, but by movement. Once lost, it becomes harder to reclaim. The longer you wait, the heavier the first step feels. Laziness understands this and uses it well. There is also a subtle arrogance hidden within delay, the assumption that you will always have time. Life, however, does not move in straight lines. Circumstances change. Energy shifts. Opportunities close. What is available today may not exist tomorrow. Our action does not require certainty. It requires willingness. Even imperfect action breaks the spell of delay. When you begin, however awkwardly, you reconnect with the flow of life. You move from observing to participating. The present moment is not a doorway to the future. It is the only place where the future is shaped. To delay is to surrender that power. Start before you feel ready. Begin before confidence arrives. Movement itself creates clarity. What is one small thing you've been postponing that you know matters to you? Share it in the comments, not as a promise of perfection, but as an act of awareness. Writing it down may be the first step toward action. Laziness is not merely the absence of effort, it is a quiet separation from life itself. When you stop engaging, you stop participating in the natural movement of existence. Life, in its essence, is dynamic. It flows, changes, and unfolds through action. To resist this flow is to feel increasingly out of place within it. Alan Watts often reminded us that life is not something happening to us, it is something happening as us. When we withdraw into inaction, we begin to feel as though life is distant, overwhelming, or meaningless. This is not because life has lost its vitality, but because we have stepped out of rhythm with it. Laziness creates the illusion of safety. By not acting, We believe we are protecting ourselves from failure, judgment, or discomfort. Yet what we are truly avoiding is participation. Over time, this avoidance turns into disconnection from purpose, from curiosity, and from the quiet joy that comes from simply being involved. When you act, even imperfectly, you feel alive. There is a subtle energy that arises from engagement, a sense that you are part of something larger than your thoughts. Laziness dulls this energy. Days blur together. Time feels heavy. Motivation fades not because you lack willpower, but because life no longer feels present. This disconnection often expresses itself as boredom or restlessness. We search for distractions, entertainment, or constant stimulation, hoping something external will make us feel alive again. But stimulation is not engagement. It numbs rather than nourishes. True vitality comes from doing, not for reward, not for recognition, but for the simple act of participation. When you cook a meal with attention, write a page with honesty, or take a step towards something uncertain, you re-enter the flow. You are no longer watching life from the sidelines. Laziness convinces us that action requires certainty, clarity, or confidence. In truth, these things emerge after movement begins. The river does not wait for permission to flow. It moves, and clarity arises from motion. To live fully is not to be constantly productive, but to be consciously engaged. Rest, when chosen with awareness, restores you. Laziness, when chosen unconsciously, slowly erodes your connection to yourself. The moment you move, however small, you return to life. You remember that you are not separate from the current. You are the current. In what area of your life do you feel most disconnected right now? But share your thoughts in the comments. Awareness is the first step back into the flow. Laziness does not disappear through force, discipline, or harsh self-judgment. In fact, the more you fight it, the stronger it often becomes. The real antidote to laziness is not intensity, it is simplicity. A single gentle action is enough to break the spell. We often imagine change as something dramatic, a sudden burst of motivation, a perfectly planned routine, or a complete transformation overnight. But this expectation itself becomes a barrier. When action feels too large, the mind retreats. Laziness thrives where action feels overwhelming. Alan Watts spoke often about the art of effortlessness, not in the sense of doing nothing, but in doing what naturally arises. A small action taken without resistance aligns you with life instead of opposing it. One step taken fully is more powerful than 1,000 steps imagined. When you take a small action, something subtle happens. The mind relaxes. The body follows. Momentum begins not as excitement, but as relief. You realize that movement was never the problem, hesitation was. Laziness tells you to wait. Wait until you feel ready, inspired, confident. But readiness is a story the mind tells itself to delay engagement. Life does not wait for readiness. It unfolds now, and it invites participation in this moment, not the perfect one. Small actions dissolve the illusion of separation. Washing a cup, opening a book, writing one sentence. These are not insignificant acts. When done with attention, they reconnect you to the present. They remind you that you are capable of movement, and movement is life. The paradox is this: the less you demand from yourself, the easier it becomes to act. When action is free from the burden of outcome, it flows naturally. You are no longer trying to become someone, you are simply expressing who you already are. Over time, these small actions accumulate, not as pressure, but as trust. You begin to trust yourself again, not because you are perfect, but because you show up. Laziness loses its grip when action becomes kind instead of forceful. The purpose of life is not constant achievement, it is participation. When you take even the smallest step with awareness, you re-enter the dance. You stop waiting for life to begin and realize it has always been happening. And in that realization, laziness fades, not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer needed. One small action you can take today to re-enter the flow of your life. Share it in the comments. Your step may inspire someone else.